Yeah, okay. Awesome. Thank you. So we've got a mix of people wanting the technical side like API. So JK's doing an awesome talk after this where you'll be going through a collab and more hands-on. I'll show you snippets of what you can do because it's like 45 minutes and I'll try and make it a bit shorter so you've got questions. So you've got time for questions, I mean. I'll show you snippets, but Google have made a lot of resources that you can use yourself that are really easy to run through as well. Because we have a broad range of kind of focus areas in the room, I'll show you what would meet those needs and you can kind of pursue those in the hour this afternoon and ask questions when you need it, I reckon. So I usually show just my background because I had a really non-traditional background pathway into tech. And I think it's really important to share that because we also have a diversity crisis in tech, as you're probably aware of. So completely non-technical background. And I think I'm a really good example that like if I can do it, anyone can. Particularly because cloud and now kind of cloud and AI merging can be very abstract if you're not used to it as well. So I just did a lot of music, was in like bands in an orchestra. And my first degree was across the river at the Queensland Conservatorium. So my degree is classical double bass, super useful. And then I ended up starting to like volunteer in a non-profit organization, Girls in Tech. I started to teach young girls how to code, and that's eventually how I learned. And I did a web development boot camp and career changed. And then I went in, so I was a web developer, but I went straight into an internship in DevOps and cloud because I requested it. And then I stayed in cloud engineering since then. And then I went into like a principal engineer / DevOps coach role. So in the break as well, if you want to know anything about cloud and DevOps, come and talk to me. That's what I normally talk on a lot more, but Gemini has become like much more of a topic people want me to talk on. So I feel like I've been talking about that more than DevOps lately, but I love talking about DevOps. Yeah, so I went into that, and then just like about 6 months ago, I switched into product management, and I became the product manager of cloud computing at like a large enterprise. So I own you own as a product owner all of the cloud compute for that enterprise. So it's like half Kubernetes and then half like legacy compute kind of offerings. Then since I've been in tech, I've talked a lot around those topics. I've done like a course that I really love on non-functional requirements in cloud computing. And you can see in the like bottom right, what we're talking about today actually was Bard about like 6 months ago, or like even less. So Bard was it conversational AI, generative AI, or chatbot? Any opinions? Yeah, when Bard came out, so which is what became Gemini, as you know, these tech companies love to rename things as they evolve. It was actually a conversational AI. So what's the difference between conversational AI and generative AI? Conversational AI is trained on dialogue, and its purpose is to converse. So I don't know if you remember when ChatGPT came out and Bard came out. I feel like ChatGPT Bard very unfairly was kind of tanked, but then they weren't designed for different things, right? Like Bard was designed as a conversational AI. ChatGPT was a generative AI. So generative AI, it just means really prompt response. Like you're feeding it a prompt, you're getting a response. It's generating content from a prompt. So now chatbot as well is like a subset of generative AI. It's just the way we see them in the world today, they're kind of more narrowly scoped. So it might be to like a particular task or a particular set of repeated kind of things that happen. And then we can kind of feed that into a chatbot and we can get it to respond in that very narrowly scoped way. Those will also probably evolve. But what we're talking about today is now generative AI. And I wanted to actually check, because back in August when I was talking about this, it was a really different situation. And I remember asking Bard at the time, what is the difference between Gemini and ChatGPT, and what is the difference between conversational AI and generative AI? And it gave me not a correct answer. And I was like, oh, they don't know anything. But this time it was spot on. So you can see, I don't know if that's big enough for at the back. Oh, let me rotate this. You can see it's pointing out that the kind of differences in terms of how they're trained, what they focus on. One of the things I love about Gemini is it's free. And I'm also not, even though I'm a Google developer expert and JK is we don't have to talk about only Google and we don't have to endorse it. We can say what we think. But yeah, I've used both ChatGPT and Gemini. Love both, but I pretty much go to Gemini now for everything. It's just like so easy, just in a web browser. Have people been using ChatGPT or Gemini already for their work and for their like study or for their life? Yeah, cool. So I thought it would be nice to start with how this is from the Train the Trainer AI deck that Google have. So this is kind of how Google are sharing their narrative around the Gemini API and how they're also explaining like the concepts of Gen AI. So what is a large language model? It's just a neural network, right? And it's basically a sophisticated autocomplete. So it's trained to recognize patterns and it's going to predict the next thing that comes. So it can do that with creative stuff like poetry. And if we feed it patterns from code, it can do that with code. It can finish the pattern. And now they're large. They have billions, maybe trillions of parameters. So imagine if you're putting that in code. Like it would take us a lifetime to do that, right? But we have the ability now to train them with the amount of compute needed so that they can do all of that learning for us, which is why we're at this really unique point where these classical natural language processing problems that previously would have taken someone like, has anyone trained a machine learning model before? Just a couple people. Is it quick when you do that? No, it takes like a really long time. So you have to, first of all, you have to go and get all your data sets, right? Maybe one data set if you're like lucky, but that's still going to be lots and lots of data points. Then you have to feed it in, you have to like have it cleaned. Then you have to create an algorithm, and then you have to tune the algorithm and like tune the model so that you're getting the output closer to what you want. Remember like those images where it's like the cat and the muffin and it was like couldn't always predict which one was which? That's like essentially training a machine learning model. All these tasks now you can just do like immediately in your browser. And we haven't been at that point before. So they can prototype very fast an application, for example. And that's a really where probably for most of you that are developers, it's of interest to you. They're also able to do human language tasks really well. So for example, humor or creativity. So if you're wanting it to generate a bunch of stuff really quickly. So for example, a bunch of ideas, a bunch of suggestions for your own prompts for something, a bunch of paragraphs on something, a piece of text, hey. And why are they different to before? Because now they have emergent abilities, and that means they don't have to be explicitly trained. You don't have to sit there at the computer training it. And do you have to be a machine learning engineer? No, we can all do this now. They also are changing how we interact with like data, because what we can see happening is we would usually have to sit as a developer and develop like a function and then test it, right? With an LLM, has anyone been using it yet for function calling in like Gemini? So what we can start doing now is feeding it text and saying, I want like a function that can do this. And for the non-technical people or like tech adjacent people in the room, function is just like a small chunk of code that will do something for us. We can say like, I want to calculate this, and it will actually print out the code for us. And then we can say, okay, we can change to a question. So one of the examples I'll show you later is like from a shop asking like, do you have a phone in stock? And you can actually feed it, I want it to have this response, like the number of the product and that it has one in stock. And it will be able to understand that you are giving it the response format that you want, and it'll be able to do that. So eventually you can kind of talk in your words, but get back code, and vice versa. So you can like feed in code and say, what is this doing? Summarize it for me. You can feed in a README from a repo, or send it a link and say, summarize what this code base is doing. I don't understand it. So we haven't been able to kind of switch before things like that before. Thirdly, they're kind of pointing out, we used to have to use like regression, for example, to find a pattern. But now we can find patterns across not only one data set, but huge data sets. Like we're on the internet, that's where it's looking. And it can get all of that information connected and summarized for us, which we also have never been able to do before. I kept this slide in. So I've like taken out a bunch of the slides and kept some in from Google's, because I went to reInvent last year, you know, the AWS like week-long thing in Las Vegas, because my company is on AWS predominantly. And I found it a little bit like tokenistic how they were talking about AI. And I also went to like a Google developer expert thing, and all of the stuff they're doing is at the forefront. And I was just like, oh, I feel like there's a difference here. And then when they showed me this slide in a presentation, I was like, oh, this is why. So they have always been at the forefront of developing these models. The transformer technology you can see there in 2017 is what underpins everything we're doing today. So what is multimodality and what is the transformer doing? Multimodality is talking about all our different inputs. So where are we going to get inputs from? We're used to typing, but what else can we use? Yeah, images, voice. Yeah, you can use like music, sound, and yeah, video you can see there. So the transformer technology, what it allows you to do is just treat everything as what's called a token. So when we can treat everything as a token, we can feed it all into this one transformer, and it can then decode whatever that thing is. So for example, if I'm going to put in audio input, it might have tone, right? So I might be saying something angrily, or I might be saying something happily. So if I'm just doing text, I'm losing the meaning there. But with the transformer technology, we can actually start applying a form of analysis to everything, and then we can actually get out the correct interpretation of like the meaning. So that's also something we haven't really been able to do before. And the really big difference that Google have in terms of how they developed Gemini, so their set of like models, is that they've built for multimodality from the start, whereas other large language models have started with text and then are having to kind of add on multimodality. So there's 3 models at the moment. Are you using just Pro today?
It's the specialized model.
Okay. So generally, like they've got Ultra Pro and Nano. Ultra is, I don't know if that's even released yet. So that can take, the difference is something like Pro, so for the developers who are using it as wanting to use the API, can take 30,000 tokens. So that's like characters or files or whatever it is. And there are ways you can get around that. So you can, for example, input like a whole corpus as one of your pieces of input, and then tell it to read all the stuff in that. When we talk about Ultra, which is, I believe, coming out soon, so it's version 1.5 of the API, I think. We're on version 1 mostly that we see now. It can take 1 million tokens. So it's like crazy amounts of text or data or whatever. And you can imagine you can just do that in your browser. Nano, just is for device tasks, so like on an Android phone. So some of the Android GDEs talk about stuff on Nano. So what we're talking about today as well is in the middle there, you can see Gemini API. Up the top is what we're using if we're just using it for our everyday life. So if I'm like going to gemini.google.com and typing in questions or whatever. At the bottom is what JK is talking about today. So Gemini for Google Cloud, it was called Duet AI until like how long? Like a week ago maybe. Like I gave a presentation last week on Gemini, and I gave like the link to my slides. The next day, the organizer, like the same as up here, was like, "Well, the link's not working." I'm like, "What?" And they moved everything around. So they're like constantly developing it. So this at the bottom is like enterprise, and the reason you'd be going to that, so like you're not going to need to go to that today, is another slide I'll talk about in a minute. And just an idea of how easy they've made it is they've kind of created this. It's essentially an ID in the browser, also with the preview and with access to all the models and the prompts, called AI Studio. And the process overall, has anyone used the API before, the Gemini API? Just one person. So I'll give the overview for everyone else. Really, you just generate an API key. Why? Because we need to make those API calls and talk to the Gemini API. Then you're going to be like essentially iterating on your prompts, and you're creating models based on like what kind of output you want to get. And again, that can be like images or it can be code. The cool thing about AI Studio, so there's some screenshots here, but we can jump into it if we've got time later as well. It's very easy to get the API key, which is really nice as well. I actually couldn't, I was on my work computer and it was really locked down and I couldn't like get into AI Studio. And it was so much harder. It took me ages like to remember where to find an API key. So I've been in like AWS, not GCP. But in here, everything's all just in there, which is really nice. This bit, you can choose the model. So you can see provision there. Why? Because we're using images. If we're using text, it would say Gemini Pro. It would be the Gemini Pro model that we're using with the API calls. And you're just putting the prompt in the middle. And then at the top right, you can always just grab the code. So this is how, as a developer, you can do everything just in text or with images, or even just say, hey, I've got these ideas. What could I do with it? And it could give you a good idea. And then you can actually start creating code very fast. I'll show you some other Gemini like ways that I thought of as well as a newer developer, like what I might use. But you can see the kind of possibilities. The code can be different languages as well. And the snippet here, I just wanted to show you like what it starts like. And if you use any of the collabs that I'm going to show you as well, it's really just like often a couple of lines at the start. So this one's like Python, you're importing the model, you're importing the generative AI model, and we would also be in some of the labs selecting like, is it Gemini Pro or is it Gemini Pro Vision if we're using images versus text. You just configure your API key, and that's pretty much all you do to start. So it's a lot less than like if you're doing web development.
Is this similar to Microsoft Copilot? Does it actually work?
Yeah, does it work with? In like IDEs. Yeah, so JK's talk will be a bit more about that. So how you'd actually like use it in the cloud and in an IDE. Google Cloud obviously has the console in the browser if you want it there, if you want to use it there versus using it locally. So yes, they do have those enterprise versions, and that is a perfect segue. Because what I was saying before is, what is the difference between Gemini API and Vertex AI? I actually found this super confusing, and I spent ages looking it up. There isn't a difference really. So the difference is like the core API is the same for Gemini and Vertex AI. The difference is, as developers, when you're starting, or as like a prospective product manager making an app, they recommend that we just start using the Gemini API because it's much lower cost. It just doesn't have the rate limits. So if you're getting, for example, if you're in your company and you're ready to actually do it at a larger scale, that's when you're going to use Vertex AI. Also, if you're wanting, for example, something in production, you want to access its higher rate limits, or if you want commercial support. So really, Vertex AI is like the commercially available version with more access to resources, essentially. But the API is the same. So what you're doing when you're testing and when you're iterating using the Gemini API is the same. And I just wanted to include a screenshot. So if you're in GCP, you can see it's kind of already been integrated there, and you can just start trying it from there. I think I'll let you talk in more detail about yours actually. I just wanted to point out as well, it is outperforming all of the other LLMs, but we're at that stage where I'm pretty sure we're just going to see them all keep, outperforming each other. The growth is exponential. Like, it's wild what it can do compared to 6 months last year. And you can see in the bottom right here, you can see it's referring to Bard. This was just in December, I think. So it became like Gemini pretty quick after that. I think that's because they started with like conversational AI. Sometimes it was referred to as a chatbot, but it was technically a conversational AI. But now Gemini is more a suite of like generative AI products. So they've kind of extended the capability hugely. The other thing I think is good about it is, probably you all know this, but just in case anyone didn't, it is connected to the internet. People often ask what's the difference, and the other big difference with this and ChatGPT is that ChatGPT is trained on like older data. So I think it was pre-COVID, like for quite a long time. And so then like during 2022, if you were using it, it like had no idea about that, So how can we use it? For that, I think think about how you can use Gemini. So for example, I'm going to stack it on that. On the left here is like a screenshot from a collab. Who's used Jupyter notebooks before, like in the browser? About half people. So if you haven't, it's a really cool way, and Google have a bunch of them. I'll link to at the end. Thank you. they basically have the code in the browser for you, and they have like this little play, and you can hover over it. Actually, it's empty when you haven't pressed it. You can hover over it and click play and run the functions, and everything's like set out there for you. So it's a really good way to learn and a really good way to test. So in terms of something simple, like here they've just got like they're calling, which model are we calling? Gemini Pro. So remember that's text, not images. And they're telling us in the response what we want to use is the generate content like method, and you can look up in the API docs what that does. And we're essentially just feeding in this prompt in text, giving a Python code to sort of list. So giving Python code to sort of list. So we want like some kind of function, and then it's just saying print the response. So you can see on the left, this is what we get directly back from the API. On the right, I put exactly the same prompt into Gemini, and I wanted to see like, what is the difference that it gives us? So you can see on the left, we just get the really pure API response, and that's what you would be working with if you're creating an app. On the right, you can see they're adding a lot more. They're kind of dividing things into sections for us. They're formatting things for us, so the code is formatted differently. That also, even though I've just asked to sort a list, it's given us different ways. So ascending order, descending order. So think about with these, what is happening under the hood with the API calls? How many API calls did they have to make to get this? And that's the kind of way I think you can start developing apps. So the other thing is in the API call, remember we just purely got the function. In Gemini, we got all this extra information, and they also told us how we could customize. So they gave us extra information about the parameter. So it's kind of giving you a list. It's finding patterns in code and giving that to you, but it's also noting, what else might they need to know? What else might they need to know to actually apply that? So you think about how you would actually write prompts and what extra prompts you would do to get that response. There's a really cool prompting collab. They have like a bunch of Gemini quick starts in an API playbook. So I'll show you that at the end as well. And then just this kind of the Jupyter notebook I showed you where you can just click through everything and play, but you can also edit the text and you can change it. And one of them is on prompting. So it's a really good kind of explanation of how you can do like your prompt so that it's going to give you like a function and a response in the format you want. So I also thought about as a student, like what is the stuff I needed to like do quickly or that I needed to learn or that like maybe I didn't quite know. So the first thing I was starting with was like, can I do, sorry, let me just do a time check. Oh, and is there a charger? Am I finishing at 10:15? 10 or like 10:10? Yeah, okay, I'm gonna go a bit quicker. So can it do a website? Oh, can you get me a charger, Anki? Sorry, I actually don't think I brought one. So, you'll have one for you. Like, he's got like a little box of, thank you very much, of everything. He's charging my phone and my computer now. Thank you. So for you at uni, or if you're like, haven't done tech and want to build a website, Gemini can kind of give you all of that. Have you tried Gemini to give you all the code for like your stuff? I wish I had this like when I was at boot camp where I literally cried every day. It was so hard. Like, no joke. I'd sit at my desk and just cry. And like no one noticed. It was awkward. But like, not that I wanted someone to notice, but yeah, I felt really pathetic. But yeah, it can feed out the code really well. And I also wanted to see, because when I did this last year, it wasn't very good when I wanted to change something. And I got it to just chuck it in a code pen so I could test it like just really quickly without setting up anything locally. So HTML, you can see how it displayed correctly. Added the CSS, it displayed really well and responsively. The JavaScript seemed to work. And then I was like, okay, can it style? And this is where last year it kind of couldn't do that. So when I asked it to change stuff, it would break. But this time it could do that straight away. So you could just copy and paste the code in. So I think they've gotten a lot more advanced in terms of the debugging and also the ability to kind of store the state from your conversation before. And that's also something you can do with the API. So you can call the API with prompt response, but you can also use this session called class, which will start storing state. And what it does is every time you make the API call, it's going to like append the response to the history of what you had before, which is how we get it understanding like what we've been saying. So it was able to update the code for me. It was able to do what I asked and change it, which I thought was great because that's the kind of thing you're going to have to be developing for like a quick prototype, right? I'm going to skip through these ones and get more to the functions. I also wanted to see if it could do basic cloud stuff. So what's the first thing you're going to have to do in a company? Like if you've never touched cloud before, create a GCP project is the first thing. And it was good with this. It can now export code to REPL IT if you just want to test things pretty quickly. If you haven't used that before, it's just like an in-browser IDE. I remember wondering or thinking, oh, that's a really good acquisition. Like I think Google acquired it like a while back. And now I see it there. I'm like, oh, how did they think of that ahead? I also wanted to check, could it do the equivalent in AWS? Very common if you're having to use cloud to like switch between them, even though they use totally different terms. And it was pulling out really good differences here. So for example, probably main difference like is you're going to have to be used to talking about GCP projects, but if it's in AWS, people talk about accounts, and they get people that are the actual cloud engineers will get confused if you're mixing those up and think, you know, you're talking about something else. I also asked about like README because that's something that maybe at uni you don't really know what that is, but it's very important for when you're documenting in a company. You need to have like, you know, local environment, how people are going to run it, how people are going to contribute to it. And I also wanted to see if it could do a React app. And I couldn't really remember React. It was very good with this as well. And I'll skip through pretty quick because you've done this. This last one was I looked up a university like curriculum because I remember we did a lot of computer science subjects, and a lot of them, if you haven't done them before, stuff like polymorphism or like a UML diagram. I used to remember being like, what is that? But you don't need to wonder anymore because it will tell you that. It couldn't display it how I wanted, but it did really well with the like the content. And with polymorphism, it gave an explanation to the extent that I could understand it because I haven't done Java, but I know at a lot of unis, they have like Java or C++ and a lot of companies. And I'm just going to click through. It did work when I tested it in REPL IT. So I wanted to show you a couple things with when you're using the API to think about as well. So as you're putting in prompts, these first two, this was Provision at the top, and it was looking at, it's in one of the labs. It's looking at an image of like a steam-powered backpack, and then it also has like little kind of, you know, 4-word summaries of text about the features. And the highlighted bits are just how it changed the text each time. But these bottom 3 are the Gemini 1.5 Pro API. So you can see the difference. Like it kind of gives you a different response each time. So I encourage you when you're testing the API and playing with it, like run things more than once. Because this is just running the same thing more than once. This is the same thing more than once. And it gives you like, unless you're in class like session where you're storing the state, it'll keep doing what you ask. You can see the language, like it's saying like revolutionary product. This was just from like a picture of a like a shitty picture of a backpack, like on a piece of paper in sketching. So I encourage you to change around your prompts. And if we look at the function, so this is a screenshot from one of the notebooks that you can access for free. It goes through how you can kind of put like what you have as an idea of functions you might use. So this one was for a shop, the one I mentioned before about a phone. So like someone's probably going to place an order, get a store location, get product info. And then you can basically you'll remember this before that snippet we had. You're defining that you want to use the Gemini Pro model, and you're saying that you want to use this tool, which is really just chucking in a bunch of functions. So tool is like a word that they're using within, like when you're using the API. There's also like quag, which is a keyword argument. So you'll see these kind of little words. The other thing that I really like about the notebooks is you can hover over like a word and it brings up an explanation of how it's used, like you do have in an IDE locally. So you can ask to the right. And I think this is a little bit, so that Colab AI, there's a button in the right, you can click down and essentially have like Gemini in your browser full code, which is really cool. Let me check the time. I might go a little quicker because this is a bit complex to explain quickly. But basically, you can see the prompt there. We prompted with text, do you have a phone in stock? Did it respond with text? No, it responded with a function. So it can tell from you like giving it that tool, okay, they want functions. And it sometimes can respond with a function. And later on, when you ask something like, is there a store that I can visit? You can see it actually responds. It starts responding with pixel 8. So it's already kind of predicting ahead what functions you'll need to answer the question. So you can kind of see under in these labs that under the hood of Gemini, it's actually always predicting ahead multiple functions to get the answer of what someone needs, because it's always trying to predict like what is their useful information rather than take literally like the function or whatever you put in it. This was another example they've got where you can feed it in a function where you want to find error messages. And you can say, okay, I want you to give me like all of the errors and the details of the errors. So you can see this is maybe creating your own observability like tool where you want it to scan through a bunch of logs and pick out the errors. I literally need this at my work now. Like I don't like the observability we have. So here you can see they're giving it a prompt like to test. So how many are errors? Like not all of them, 3 out of the 4. And using the Gemini API, it can actually print back to you. It knows that you want like a list of arguments and it knows that you want them in a programmatic way. So it'll give you like a structured prompt like that you could potentially use in code. So it's really interesting how you can now switch between code and text as well. I also had it how I use it for like life. So like you can do a budget, you can do like workout stuff, but I'll skip through that really quickly. Oh yeah, I asked it to do a meal plan because I really struggle to like keep cooking for myself and be motivated. And at the end here, when you have these slides, I'll give you the link to all the slides. This is all the resources where you can go into everything. So for example, they've got Google Cloud Platform Generative AI as a repo with a bunch of quick starts. And then they also have a Gemini API playbook. And both of those have a bunch. If you see .ipynb, that's like the Jupyter Notebook kind of link, or Colab, they call it. And you can usually run in Colab, then it'll just open in your browser window for people who haven't used it before. All of these are intros to like how to use the SDK, for example, and I recommend this intro Gemini Python one is like how to use the SDK and how to start understanding the methods that it has. You can see other examples as well. So some of you wanted to know like commercial use cases. So you can have a look in the use cases folder. And this is the Gemini API cookbook. And in there, in the directory called Quick Starts are also a bunch of notebooks. So those are things like today, what you're going to do with JK is a little bit more involved, like where you're actually needing to log into stuff. With the notebook, you don't. You just run in the browser and it can do everything from there. I've linked to the docs in the slides so you can look through them. And at the API overview is where you can get the information or the reference for what, for example, that function like generate content for exactly what it does and what it can feed back to you. And there are also, you're getting credits today. So I just wanted to make you aware that they're really great. They call it Google Cloud Skills Boots. It used to be Quick Labs, but they're really great like learning paths they have. So for those of you that are wanting to go in more specific directions with the dev kind of stuff, that might be helpful for you, like the Gemini for Google Cloud or the generative AI one. I put the sign up for Gemini 1.5. Some people usually want that. So you can scan that when you get the slides.